John Parson those days.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, let's go.
Chaf Mud Aleph, 20a. So yesterday we learned that Rabbi Meir travels between the difference in his learning between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva did not protest his adding the sulfite kankantum to his ink,
The binder.
this binder, adhesive, and Rabbi Shmuel did protest. Rabbi Shmuel said you have to have the kind of ink that's capable of being erased, and he derived that from the law of the Sotah. And the Gemara told us the details of the conversation between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shmuel, where Rabbi Shmuel enjoined Rabbi Meir to be careful about extra letters. And Rabbi Meir responded by saying, I'm so careful with the letters that I have this adhesive to make sure that if a fly were to land on one letter, even the corner of the letter doesn't get erased, so it doesn't change the meaning by changing a dalet to a resh. But what we have, in terms of what's important to know, we go to the next lines of the Gemara, is two things. Number one, that Rabbi Meir began his studies at Rabbi Akiva and then went to Rabbi Shmuel. That's number one, historical fact that Gemara is going to challenge in a moment. And number two, we have the fact that Rabbi Akiva did not object to his adding kankantum, and Rabbi Shmuel did, which seems to be a halachic dispute here. Rabbi Akiva is okay with this kankantum, the sulfite being added, and Rabbi Shmuel is not okay with it. So now let's see, the Gemara is going to introduce another Mishnaic text, another text from the Mishnaic era. And the Gemara is going to compare that with the text we read yesterday and see if the two jive or whether they seem contradictory. So it says the Gemara like this. It's 3 lines from the counting down from the wider lines. There's a little test there. Sorry, before the test, it says Eini. Eini, is this the case? Is the text we just read, which is not a Mishnaic age text. I'm sorry, it was Rabbi Yehuda, who's from the Gemara's age, who told us the name of Shmuel, who's from an earlier era in the Gemara age, who told us the name of Rabbi Meir. Now the Gemara is going to introduce a Mishnaic age text, which seems to contradict the version of the story as told by Shmuel, by Yehuda, the name of Shmuel. So presumably this latter text now would have more validity because it's a Mishnaic age text from that era, whereas Rabbi Yehuda is speaking the name of Shmuel, who's speaking the name of the previous generation. So let's see the version as it appears. Yeah, so the text we read yesterday wasn't the Mishnaic text. It was Rabbi Yehuda speaking the name of Shmuel, the name of Rabbi Meir, right? And Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shmuel are sages of the Gemara's era. Now the Gemara is going to introduce Mishnaic text, which seems to contradict the version of the story that they had.
They have that name for that you mentioned many times before. You challenge something with a greater authority.
Yeah, so usually, but the Gemara doesn't introduce it with that word for whatever reason. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Well, Tanya, but we learned. Rabbi Meir said, when I study under the tutelage of Rabbi Shmuel. So yesterday, Rabbi Shmuel told us that Rabbi Meir started by Rabbi Akiva and ended with Rabbi Shmuel. And here in this Mishnaic age text, it starts out where Rabbi Meir is at Rabbi Shmuel. That's issue number one, the historical record, where he started studies at Rabbi Akiva and then Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Now, what did he hear by Rabbi Shmuel? It says like this, I would put the sulfite into my ink, and he didn't protest. When I transferred my studies from Rabbi Shmuel to Rabbi Akiva, Asra Alai, he forbade me from adding the sulfite. So it's the reverse as the text yesterday. Yesterday we learned that he started by Rabbi Akiva and then transferred to Rabbi Shmuel. That's number one, issue number one. Issue number two is that in yesterday's text, Rabbi Akiva did not protest and Rabbi Shmuel did. Whereas today is the reverse. Rabbi Shmuel doesn't protest and Rabbi Akiva does. So who's of the view that you may add the kankantum, the sulfite, and who's of the view that you should not? Yesterday, Rabbi Akiva was okay with it, and Rabbi Shmuel was not. And today's the reverse. Rabbi Shmuel is okay with it, and Rabbi Akiva is not. And if the Gemara says, Kasha Shimush Ashimush, we have a contradiction in the tradition as to where he studied first. Yesterday, we learned that he studied first under Rabbi Akiva and then transferred to Rabbi Shmuel. And now we're learning he started by Rabbi Shmuel and then transferred to Rabbi Akiva. And Kasha, Asra, We also have a contradiction between who is the one who forbade the adding of the kankantim. Yesterday we learned Rabbi Shmuel forbade it, and today we're learning Rabbi Akiva forbade it. Yeah, we're clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
It
Clear?
seems like, yes, the Mishnah should have more weight.
Seemingly,
Seemingly.
because it's correct. Seemingly, should have more weights. That's right. Meaning it's a written text from that era, presumably, as opposed to Rabbi Huda speaking in the name of Shmuel, who's speaking in the name of Rabbi Meir.
I'll say something about,
Well, let's see. So Gemara says, Bishlema, with regard to the question of Shimush Ashimush, the contradiction of where he studied. Did he study Rabbi Akiva first and then Rabbi Shmuel, or started by Rabbi Shmuel and then Rabbi Akiva? That like kasha, that is not a contradiction. We can resolve that. How's that? Because we can say that Mikara also like Rabbi Akiva. He first started out by Rabbi Akiva, as Shmuel told us yesterday. But Kivan Dole Matzi Kamali Bey, because he was incapable of following the level of learning at Rabbi Akiva, also like Rabbi Shmuel, he transferred to Rabbi Shmuel, which had a lower level of learning. The Gamar Gemara, and he completed his studies informationally, just to know what's the law and what's not the law, just to know the opinions. And Hadar also like Rabbi Akiva, but now that he had all that information, he went back to Rabbi Akiva, and Savar Svara, he went to pummel the depth of the reasoning. So it would seem from the Gemara here that Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva had different styles of learning, not just different levels, but different styles. Rabbi Shmuel's style of learning was to stick to the conclusions, like learning the code of Jewish law. There's no code of Jewish law at the time, but just to know the conclusions. So-and-so said this, so-and-so, Yishmael, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that. Organize all the information and all the opinions in an organized fashion, point by point by point by point. That was Rabbi Shmuel's style of teaching and learning. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, would do comparative analysis, more like what the Gemara does. Well, what does he say here? And how does it compare to that? And if we have a new situation that isn't described by either of these Mishnahs, how would we derive the law based on that? So he was more into the pummeling of depth and behind the scenes of what's the thinking behind the concluding laws, thus being able to derive new laws in new scenarios and so on. So Rabbi Akiva was a different style of learning, which required much more knowledge, much deeper knowledge. So the Gemara says, therefore, that when we have a contradiction as to where he started and where he went, yesterday we learned that he started Rabbi Akiva and then went to Rabbi Shmuel. And today we learned that he went to Rabbi Shmuel and then went to Rabbi Akiva. Well, we can say both are true. He started by Rabbi Akiva, couldn't keep up, and said, look, I have so much more information I need to learn first before I come back to Rabbi Akiva. So he went to Rabbi Shmuel and said, okay, let's learn all the information. Let's get all of the information down pat. Now that I have it, I'm going to go back to Rabbi Akiva and see if I can pummel the depth. So that would explain the transference contradiction. That's easy to resolve, says the Gemara. Yeah, is that clear?
Yeah,
it's pretty straightforward, I think. What's interesting though, sorry?
It doesn't yet resolve the issue why it's a contradiction.
So the contradiction of to where he went first is resolved. Where he went first is resolved. Because today it didn't say, I started out my studies at Rabbi Akiva. It just says, I went to Rabbi Akiva and then I went to Rabbi Shmuel.
Yeah, but it doesn't resolve the issue
of who said which is forbidden.
Why one says it's forbidden.
Right, that's not resolved. So you have two contradictions. One contradiction was the record of where he studied. That's been resolved because he started at one place, went to the other, then went back. The question of who forbids, that's still unresolved.
Was he one of the 24,000?
So Rabbi Meir is one of the students that actually survived the 24,000, and after the 24,000 was one of the 5 that Rabbi Akiva reestablished Torah with. And the end is Rabbi Meir, sorry? Rishon Baruch is another. The end was that Rabbi Meir actually made it to an extremely high level, to the point that the sages would often say, we disagree with you because we don't understand you completely. We understand that you have a much deeper level, but we can't get there, so we're going to have to disagree. That's about Rabbi Meir. So it's interesting to see the progression. He started by Rabbi Akiva, didn't work out, went to Rabbi Shmuel, got all the information he needed, then went back to Rabbi Akiva. Okay, now that I have all this information, take me to the next level. And clearly it worked. Okay, but as to your point, Ella Asra. But as for the issue of who forbids it, what? Yesterday we learned that Rabbi Yishmael forbade the adding of sulfite, and today we learned that Rabbi Akiva forbade the adding of sulfite, or is the other way around? Yeah. Yesterday we learned that Rabbi Akiva was okay with it, and today we learned that Rabbi Shmuel was okay with it. Yeah. So that is kasha's contradiction. Says the Gemara, indeed, kasha, unresolved contradiction. Sorry,
Yeah.
Rabbi Shmuel's position or Shmuel's tradition. Rabbi Yehuda speaking in the name of Shmuel, his tradition as to who forbade the sulfite is under question, considering the Mishnaic H text that says the reverse.
It would seem though, I mean, this is a stretch, but what we learned yesterday would be maybe the more prevailing view because it's the later in time after Rabbi Shmuel had a chance.
That's a good point.
To study it and then come back.
Right. So the question is if Shmuel saw this text. The question would be if Shmuel saw this text. But assuming he did, that's a good point. Because he assumed that he read the text and still said no.
Digested that earlier in Mishnah.
Possible. Assuming he saw the text, it would be correct. The Gemara just says it's unresolved. It doesn't say who's suspect or whose opinion we're taking. Just says it's unresolved.
And they didn't understand them.
Who?
The sages.
Rabbi Meir. Yeah, that was later on in his life. This is talking about the beginning of his career. And when he first started learning, right? Because he started out not being able to keep up with Rabbi Akiva. So we're talking about the beginning of his scholarly career.
What happened with Einstein. When he developed the theory of relativity, he invited all the smartest scientists.
They couldn't follow.
And he gets up on the stage and he says, I'm going to explain this theory to you. I don't think any of you will ever get it. That's why.
Yeah. Okay.
Sometimes they go so high, so
sure. Sure.
Such depth that you just can't fathom.
Sure. We each have our limit, and we try to push it a little bit every day. Right. Okay. So now the Gemara gets to
So today, but what do they do today, the scribes, in terms of this law?
Okay, so let's learn that now.
Okay.
Yeah.
No,
that's right.
Okay.
No, so what we learned till now is Rabbi Meir, and what he learned under Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. One of the two forbade him from using the sulfite, and one of the two okayed it. We don't know which one, considering the contradiction. But now the Gemara gets to a Mishnaic text in which Rabbi Meir himself speaks and says what his view is. So we can at least come to some conclusion based on his view, considering he learned from both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. Whichever one's the one who forbade, whichever one's the one who allowed, not relevant, or at least unresolved, but now Rabbi Meir can speak for himself. That's the last line on Chaf Mad Aleph. Tanya, we learned. Rabbi Yehuda said, Omer Haya Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir would say, this is different in Rabbi Yehuda than yesterday's Rabbi Yehuda. Yesterday's Rabbi Yehuda is Rabbi Yehuda who speaks in the name of Shmuel, who speaks in the name of Rabbi Meir. That would be Rabbi Yehuda who lived in the era of the Gemara. Here it's a Mishnaic age text, so that would be Rabbi Yehuda of the Mishnaic age, would be Rabbi Yehuda Nasi probably, which is the Mishnaic era Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda of the Mishnaic era, Omer said, Omer Haya Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, who was, as we just learned, was a scribe, and he learned under Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. So he would say, Lakol matilin kankanta. One puts sulfite into all inks they use, into their ink, whatever you're writing, Torah, Tefillin, Mezuzah, Megillah, whatever it is you're writing, you put that sulfite. And this, to the best of my knowledge, is the halacha. Chutz, with the exception of Parshas Sotah Bavad, the chapter of the Sotah alone. Now, from the phrasing, okay, let's see. Let's leave that for a second. So Rabbi Meir says, everything that you write ink with, you add sulfite, the exception of the chapter describing the Sotah. Now, it would seem from the text, and this comes clear in a moment, that he's referring to the description of the Sotah even in the Torah. Not just the Sotah that you're writing to erase for a woman who is an actual Sotah, but the section of the Torah that describes the law, that too has to be written without the sulfite. Which means you'll be using one ink for the entire Torah, and when you arrive at the section of the Torah, Bamidbar chapter, what chapter was it again? We don't remember. We looked it up a bunch of times. We can't remember. So we all have good memories. Yeah. So that chapter in the Torah, which described the half a chapter which we read that describes the Sotah, you would switch ink and use ink that doesn't have the sulfite. This is Rabbi Meir's view. Sorry? This would be the view of Rabbi Yehuda speaking on behalf of Rabbi Meir.
Why would they do that? Because they weren't clear whether or not it was.
Let's get to that. We'll get to the second why in a second. Let's get down the opinions. We'll get to the why in a moment. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Omer Mishmoi. Now, that was Rabbi Huda speaking in the name of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Huda said in the name of Rabbi Meir, you put the sulfite into every ink with the exception of when you're writing when you're writing the parsha of the Sotah, even if you're writing it in the Torah. Now, Rabbi Yaakov said in the name of Rabbi Meir, Chutz mi parsha Sotah shal mikdash. That Rabbi Meir said, they're both speaking in the name of Rabbi Meir, either Rabbi Huda or Rabbi Yaakov. So Rabbi Yaakov says in the name of Rabbi Meir, you add sulfite to every ink with the exception of the portion of the Sotah that you're writing in the temple that's going to be erased. But if you're writing the law of the Sotah as part of the Torah, then you do use sulfite. Clear on the dispute here?
Yeah, because you can't erase the Torah.
Oh, so the Gemara asks, by Benayim, what's the undergirding dispute between Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Yaakov?
I'm sorry, what was Rabbi Yaakov's?
That everything gets sulfite with the exception of the Sotah that you're using in the temple, which means, according to Rabbi Yaakov, if you're writing, Rabbi Huda said that if you're writing a Torah and you get to the chapter of the Sotah, you don't put sulfite in that chapter.
You don't, but in the Sotah proceeding, you do.
Mixing up. No. That one for sure not also. Anytime you're writing Sotah, according to Rabbi Huda, you don't put sulfite, even if it's in the Torah. Whereas Rabbi Yaakov says, no. When you're writing in the Torah, add the sulfite like the rest of the ink in the Torah. When you're writing in the temple to be erased, then don't put the sulfite.
Okay.
Clear? So the Gemara asks, so this is the end of the Mishnaic text. Dispute between Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Yaakov as to what Rabbi Meir's position is. So says the Gemara, my Benayim, what is the distinction? What's the undergirding dispute between Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Huda? So Rabbi Yirmiyah explains. Rabbi Yirmiyah is of the Gemara era. So this is now us in the Gemara era discussing the Mishnaic text. The question is, the dispute is, can you use that section of the Torah that describes the Sotah? Can you use that to erase in the temple? So let's see how this will work out. Let's just.
When you erase it from the Torah?
That's what it would seem. Let's imagine like this. Let's think of a hypothetical like this. If the guy wrote a Torah, someone wrote a Torah, yeah, and he's following Rabbi Huda's view, so the part of the Torah that describes the Sotah, he didn't put sulfite. And now the Torah became invalid for whatever reason. And they have to bury it. So instead of burying the whole thing, he cuts out the part that has a Sotah and uses that for a Sotah in the temple. Can he do that or not? According to Rabbi Huda, yes, you may, which is why you didn't put the sulfite in the beginning to begin with in that section. And Rabbi Yaakov says, no, you can't do that. So put the sulfite because you cannot do that. Clear?
I'm sorry. Can you tell me Rabbi Yehuda's opinion again?
That when you're writing the Torah,
he doesn't use the sulfite in all, or you use it in everything?
You use the sulfite everywhere with the exception of the passage describing the Sotah.
In the proceeding.
In the Torah.
In the Torah.
When you write the Torah, you write from beginning to end.
Yeah.
You get to the chapter of the Sotah,
Yeah.
change your ink, and use ink that doesn't have sulfite.
Oh, okay.
That's Rabbi Huda's view. Following?
Yeah.
Why is he saying that? Explains the Gemara. Because theoretically, you can use that passage that you wrote in the Torah, you can use that for the actual Sotah.
That's the reason, okay. Except,
you can use it for the actual Sotah.
Only if the Torah is.
I'm just giving a hypothetical if the Torah is invalid, which would make sense, right? I don't know that's, I don't see Rashi saying that, but let's just assume that that's the case, because it'll make it easier for us to assume why is he cutting out a section of the Torah, but this makes sense. He has to discard the Torah for whatever reason, so he cuts out this one section and gives it to the temple, so they use it for the next Sotah.
isn't there somewhere written that they made a woman made a copy of the, well, that's just to make the copy. She wrote the words that, the part of the parsha that talks about the Sotah proceeding, she put it on a plaque in the temple.
That was to be copied if you're writing it there. Yeah. Okay, but wait. Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying you can cut it out
and use that for the
That's
Sotah.
Rabbi Yehuda's.
Yes.
Rabbi Yirmiyah's.
Rabbi Yirmiyah is explaining Rabbi Huda's view.
Rabbi Yehuda's view, okay.
Right. Whereas Rabbi Yaakov explains Rabbi Yirmiyah
Uh-huh.
is of the view that you may not do that. And because you may not use the section from the Torah itself in the actual temple for a Sotah, therefore you should have sulfite.
Therefore, put the sulfite.
Because you can't use it anyway. So put the sulfite so it doesn't get erased. Clear? The Gemara goes now one level deeper to explain another layer of this dispute. Okay. Now, Bahani Tanoi, this dispute as to whether or not you may use the passage of the Torah that describes the Sotah, that dispute, Tihani Tanoi, follows a different dispute. What's the other dispute? Something that came up earlier, which is what I thought you were going to mention. In Tanya, we learned, Ein Megilta Ksheda Lahashkes Basotah Acheres. If you wrote, if there's a Sotah woman, and you wrote a scroll for her, and for whatever reason she's not drinking the water, now you have a written scroll, what do you do with it? According to one opinion, you may not give it to the next woman. Why?
Because you had to have the intent, it was for that particular.
It has to be written for that particular woman. If that's the case, can you use the passage in the Torah? No, you can't, because it has to be written for that woman.
It wasn't written by.
That's right. So that would follow Rabbi Yaakov's opinion. Rabbi Yaakov, who said you may not use the text of the Torah, which is why you got to add sulfite to that part of the Torah. Why is that? Explains the Gemara now. Because these are the view, it has to be written for the woman. And you're writing it for Torah.
Yeah.
And therefore you cannot use it for the woman in the site, and therefore add the sulfite. But Rabbi Yechia bar Yoshia Omer, Rabbi Yechia, son of Yoshia, says, if you wrote a scroll for woman, no problem, and it didn't work out for that woman, not a problem, use it for the next woman. So he's of the view that you don't need to write the text specifically for that woman. If that's the case, you may use a cutout from the Torah. If that's the case, don't put sulfite in that section. And that would be the view of Rabbi Yehuda in his view of Rabbi Meir. So there's layers and layers and layers. All one.
In the name of Rabbi Meir is that you don't need intent when you write that part.
That's correct. And therefore you can use a cutout from the Torah. And therefore don't put sulfite in that section.
You use that over and over again?
Sorry?
You use that over and over?
Well, once it's erased, you can't use it anymore. But
You can go in again.
the same paper?
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. If you can salvage the paper, I wonder, I don't know, the question. If you can salvage the parchment, can you write again? I don't know.
I would think that over time, though, the ink would dry and therefore it would be rendered unable to.
Apparently, without the sulfite, you can easily wash it out, apparently.
So if that's the case, how does it not rub off in regular use?
Well, in regular use, you don't get Torah wet.
Water.
Yeah, in regular use, you
You
don't
need the water.
That's right. I don't know if you remember, we had last year during COVID, we had a drip fall on one of the Torahs.
Well,
And it rubbed the ink. The ink didn't come off, but it kind of smudged it. We had a scribe fix it and everything.
It had the
Remember
sulfite,
that?
so it should have been, presumably had the.
So the problem was that it was Shabbos or was Yom Tov, and we couldn't like dry it out quickly. So the ink slowly seeped in.
Oh.
In theory, for a weekday, you could have taken like a little tissue, put it on, and then the tissue would suck up the water, and it would have been fine, because it was like a bubble first, you know.
Sat there.
But then it sat there because the Shabbos you couldn't do anything, so we covered it and left it, and we fixed it later. Yeah. Anyway, so this is where we are at the moment, where we're linking the two disputes. Can you use, right? There's three layers of dispute. One is, do you put sulfite in the ink when you're writing the section of the Torah that describes the Sotah? Dispute one, layer one. That is built on layer two. Can you use a cutout from the Torah for the Sotah woman? And that connects to layer three, which is, do you have to write the Sotah on behalf of a specific woman, or you could just write it for anybody and use it for the next one? Okay. Gemara tomorrow is going to separate between layer three and layer two and tell us that not necessarily is it true that if you, like, it's very possible for me to say that you're forbidden to use a text you wrote for one woman and transfer it to another, and yet I'll still allow you to use a cutout from the Torah. Why? Because the cutout from the Torah was written for nobody, and therefore use it for whoever you want. But once you write a text for a specific woman, you can't transfer it. So tomorrow the Gemara is going to. That's correct. So tomorrow the Gemara is going to separate between layer two and layer three. That's coming tomorrow. So that's why I'm making this, trying to clearly stack the levels.
Means any intent.
Does no intent mean no intent mean any intent, or does no intent mean you've locked out of any intent?
Right.
Or does that mean it's blank and you can use it for any intent? Yeah, that's coming tomorrow. That's why I'm stacking it like this, so we know layer one and two are locked together, but layer two and three, the Gemara is going to take apart tomorrow.
Robert, you said something before, by continued use of the Torah, can some of the letters be rubbed out? You're not allowed to touch the letter.
That's right.
That's why we use that pointer.
Yeah.
And the pointer doesn't even touch the letters. It's underneath.
Oh, does it?
Yeah. We don't. Yeah, you should. It sometimes touches, but you should keep it away because you can scratch off the ink. God forbid. You can scratch off the ink. Okay, have a wonderful day, Eden.
Yeah.